Okay, Andreas Zumach from the International Peace Factory, we invited him today because we think the war on terror, we have to find ways to stop it, because it has brought more and more disaster for many people. It's self-terroristic for those where they bomb and so on, and even supports terrorism, because more and more people have reasons to defend their lives and lose relatives. And so we have to find a strategy. From the US, there is an institute called Ron Paul Institute, and the Scott Horton, he made just now a book, Enough is Enough. The war on terror has to stop. So, and to be able to do it, we need an international coalition, and we need much more knowledge. Today, I just got to know that the Berghofer Foundation already in September made an appeal of different peace groups that we need now dialogue, even with those groups who use violence, because without dialogue, you can't come out. And naturally, that the reasons why people are opposing the developments in their countries, even with wrong ways, has to be traced. So one of the experts in Germany about these problems is Andreas Zumach. A long time he was journalist in Geneva and especially specialized on international conflicts and international law. Thank you very much that you join us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Good evening. I hope you can all see the map which I have provided. Can you all see that right now? Yeah? Yes. Mm-hmm. You can see it. Okay. I want to start out by first make us all aware that the word terrorism is a very ambiguous term because so far there has not been an internationally agreed upon definition of what terrorism is. The United Nations is discussing it since 20 years. There's a draft for a anti-terrorism convention, which is ready by 90%, but there is no definition for the three reasons you are all aware of it. Your terrorist is my freedom fighter, and my freedom fighter is your terrorism. Even the US and Great Britain, the strongest allies, closest allies since the anti-Hitler coalition, have not agreed yet whether or not the Irish Republic Army in Northern Ireland have been terrorists or freedom fighters. So the second dispute is whether in a internationally agreed upon definition of terrorism, there should be not only terrorism committed by individuals or by groups or organizations or by networks, but also by states. And roughly 30 of the 193 UN member countries would prefer to include state terrorism in a definition. Among them, for instance, the South African government, because many of the former liberation movement, the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela, when they were sitting in exile before 1994 in London or Amsterdam or Lusaka, they were murdered and killed by package bombs which were sent by the apartheid regime per mail. So there is state terrorism, but the majority of member countries, including mainly the Western countries, reject to include state terrorism. And the third dispute is whether or not a legitimate violent resistance against illegal occupation like we have it currently in Palestine, like we had it in Iraq, the US occupation between 2003 2011, whether violent resistance against this occupation should be termed terrorism or should be considered legal. And therefore, the use of the word terrorism, which is now one of the most often used terms in public language and media language since the events of September 11th, 2001, we have to be careful and always make clear who is using this term to legitimize what kind of actions against whom. Having said this, I will use the term, but we all know about the problematic. The war on terrorism was declared by US President George Bush on September 12th, 2001, following the attacks of September 11th. And there was at this time in Germany, but also in many other countries, only a small minority of voices who said, yes, these attacks of September 11th were a crime against humanity. And now we should use all available national and international means of police investigation, of judicial means to track, to track down those who have been responsible, who committed those acts, those who planned it, who organized it, who financed it, to bring them to justice. But the argument was war is the wrong answer, especially a war as a campaign of revenge, like George Bush characterized it in his speech on September 12th. These minority voices, at least here in Germany and other European countries, have been laughed at and booed out in parliamentary debates. And today, we have to say, 20 years later, those minority voices had it right. Second remark, at least in Western official writing of history in the media and by the established governments and parties, they all claim that this war on terrorism, which George Bush announced and then which started with the first US airstrikes on October 7th and 8th against Al-Qaeda locations in Afghanistan, that this was based on international law. And the argument is that United Nations Security Council Resolution 1368, which was adopted on September 12th, unanimously would be the legal foundation. This is wrong, and we should always make this point clear. This is wrong. This resolution 1368 only in its preamble states that the US has the legitimate right of immediate self-defense according to Article 51 of the UN Charter. But beyond that, the text of the resolution does not provide any legitimation for the use of military means. The deciding phrase to allow the US to use all necessary means, which would have been necessary, you cannot find that in this resolution. In Germany, and also again in other Western countries, there is a dispute even among peace and conflict research institutes like the one Wolfgang just mentioned, the Berghoff Foundation, who do criticize or who would agree that this war has failed. They would still argue that this immediate phase of the war between October 7th and mid-December 31 till the toppling of the Taliban government would have been necessary, and that supposedly that there would not have been any alternative to go militarily to this point. I fully disagree, but I would, for the point of argument right now, for a moment, accept this position and then ask the question, what further fundamental mistakes have been committed since at the end of 2001 in the last 20 years? And I would identify 4 or 5 of these fundamental mistakes. Number one, the main ally for the US Air Forces in these first 8 weeks of the war were the ground forces of different warlords in Afghanistan, mainly the Northern Alliance, who did not have or do not have a ideological conviction or religious conviction like the Taliban do or the so-called Islamic State or Al-Qaeda did at the time. But other than that, these warlords are no better at all concerning regarding their concern for democratic rights, for women's rights, etc., etc. But they were the main allies for the US Air Force. They fought the ground battle against Al-Qaeda and against the Taliban. And after this military victory in December 2001, the NATO countries who then were participating in the invasion never ended this very problematic coalition with these warlords. They didn't do anything in the last 20 years to drive back the political, the economic, and the military influence these warlords do have in Afghanistan. And my argument is, under this kind of circumstances, things could not have become better in Afghanistan. Second fundamental mistake, you remember there was a big conference organized in Bonn, the capital of Germany, back in 2001. bringing together many factions from Afghanistan, except for the Taliban, except for Al-Qaeda, and many, not only Western countries. And at this Afghanistan conference, the US delegation arrived with a gentleman called Mr. Karzai, and the US delegation said this should be the future president of Afghanistan. There were some experts on the table, especially German experts, who strongly argued against it and who said, even though there has always been somebody in Kabul, the Afghan capital, who was called either president or king or whatever, there never was a government which really had the control and executed the control and power over the whole country. The real power and control always had been and still is with local or regional tribe leaders, warlords, the Taliban, whatever. And if this is true, then you cannot just bring in somebody and centralize the government in Kabul and expect that this would work. And even if Mr. Karzai would have not turned out to be as corrupt as he actually was, this would have not worked. Third, very fundamental mistake, which is still valid till today, the NATO countries did do nothing to drive back the drug economy of Afghanistan, a country where more than 60% of the gross national product is made out of drug economy, and which is and still has been and still is responsible for up to 85% of the heroin that is being consumed worldwide, most of it in North America and Western Europe and in Iran. This has brought in so much money, we talk about billions of US dollars, into Afghanistan, so that everybody, every warlord, every Taliban, whoever was not interested in a peaceful resolution of the conflict, could finance and buy as many weapons and pay as many soldiers or militias as he ever wanted. And again, this has been a situation under which nothing could have become better in Afghanistan, and still will not become better if this is not changed. I have ideas how the country could be turned away from the drug dependency on drug economy, but I come to that later. The fourth mistake was that at least we in the Western and the NATO countries, have been lied to by the political leadership and by the military leadership of our countries for the last 20 years about the realities in Afghanistan. As you probably know, in the end of 2019, the Pentagon in Washington conducted a very broad study among 400 US soldiers who had been in Afghanistan, many of them several times. And the result was that each single of these 400 soldiers questioned said, we have been lied to by our own government about the situation and the problems and the reality in Afghanistan. And the Pentagon general who conducted the study in his conclusion said, we never knew what we were doing in Afghanistan, and if the US American population would have really known what the situation is, there would have never been sufficient support in the US population for this war. The same could be said in Germany, and I will spare you the examples now of statements now being made by former Secret Service people and others who all tell me, we knew about the situation, we told our government, and we were always surprised when the government in Germany told the opposite, both to the general public and also to parliament. For my country, Germany, there has been a specific problem, very specific, different from other participating NATO countries. The German government in end of December 2001 declared that they would not send soldiers to actually fight a war, but they would send soldiers to protect civil organizations who at this time were doing civil rebuilding in the north of Afghanistan, which at this time was rather calm and peaceful. And this got a lot of support, even from people who were skeptical at all vis-a-vis this whole mission. They said, okay, this is an approach we could accept. but it was a huge illusion. The illusion was that you could have in Afghanistan forever a situation by which in one part of the country, the calmer part in the north, there would be civil reconstruction by civil organizations simply protected by the presence of some German soldiers. And in the rest of the country, in the south, the west, and the east, there was a hot war fought by the other NATO countries with a lot of victims also among the civil population. To think or to have to believe that these two realities could exist alongside each other without conflicting and each other was a big illusion. And at the latest in May 2006, when the Taliban leadership made a big press conference in Kabul announcing we will change our strategy by tomorrow, we will stop the open battle with the NATO countries because we can only lose, but we will start a campaign throughout the whole of Afghanistan with suicide attacks, with terrorist attacks, with bomb attacks, etc. From this point, it should have been clear that the German soldiers and the German reconstruction efforts in the north would have been more and more affected. And this is exactly what happened. And in response to this, the German parliament not only extended the mandate for the German soldiers every year, but they also escalated it to a war fighting mandate and gave the German soldiers more and more weapons. So to sum it up, compared to what the official goals of this war was, and let's be clear, the officially declared goals, both of Mr. Bush in September 12th, but also then later by NATO, was number one, to drive out, to eradicate, to destroy or whatever the Al-Qaeda fighters and logistics in Afghanistan. And secondly, to make sure that Afghanistan would not again become the host of Islamic terrorist groups that might then threaten the West. And that was the rationale for toppling the Taliban government. Compared to these two officially declared goals, this first battle of the war of terrorism has utterly failed. And if you just briefly look at the other four battles that have been or still are being conducted in this war of terrorism, the next one was Iraq after the illegal invasion of the US and Great Britain in spring 2003. We had 8 years of a US illegal occupation of Iraq till the end of 2011. And during this 8 years, the US occupation power committed all possible mistakes an occupation power could possibly commit. And they were responsible for arming up Sunnite militias to have them fight Shiite opponents, or as they called them at the time, Shiite militias. And then years later, the US would arm up Shiite militias to fight Sunnite opponents or terrorists. And this was the breeding ground for what then became the so-called Islamic State. The Islamic State at the beginning was only a force of protection for the Sunnite minority in Iraq against both Shiite militias and against the US army. But they grew and they became strong. They finally conquered a lot of the modern weapons the US has pumped into Iraq since 2003. And finally, and to many of our surprise, in spring 2014, the Islamic State conquered a quarter or a third of the Iraqi territory, and then later on more than half of the Syrian territory. So I would argue this battle of the war of terrorism has not only failed, again, compared to what the officially declared goals were, but it was and still is counterproductive. The third battle was then the battle to destroy or drive out or whatever the so-called Islamic State out of Syria, which was successful to some degree. It was a joint effort at times between Western countries, some Arab countries, and Russia. But again, it has failed in the sense that the Islamic State has been driven out of Syria, most of the parts at least, but the victory that was declared both in Moscow and in Washington in summer 2018 is a fake. The Islamic State is still alive and kicking. They have gone to other countries. They have appeared on the Gaza Strip and occupied Palestine. They have then appeared in Afghanistan, and they are responsible for that. Afghanistan, for the first time since the Soviet invasion in December 79, is experiencing violence between the Sunnite majority and the Shiite minority, because the IS fighters are blowing up Shiite houses, Shiite mosques, etc., etc. So in Afghanistan now, we have the same dynamic of inner Islamic conflict up to violence and bloodshed like we have seen it in Iraq and partially in Syria. The fourth battle has been and still is the battle in Mali. And here you could also make the point that the Tuareg in the north, who for many, many decades had demanded, if not their own state, but at least some far-reaching autonomy, they never ever had a chance to come even close to that till the end of 2013, when they all of a sudden, and to many, many observers' surprise, drove out the regular Mali army out of the north, and then they stormed down to the south and were about to conquer the capital. Why was that possible? It was only possible because both IS fighters from Syria and Iraq and mercenaries from Libya, which had been armed by the French, the British, and the Americans for the war to topple Gaddafi, after those jobs, in parentheses, were fulfilled, these people, with their modern Western weapons, went partially to Mali and supported the Tuareg there. So this, in brief, are the battles of what I call the failed and counterproductive war against terrorism. And my prediction is in Mali, where you have many differences to the situation in Afghanistan, but also many, many striking similarities, this battle will be lost sooner or later to, I expect, the withdrawal of at least the French, the German and the European military missions from Mali during the course of the next year, and then probably also of the French special forces. For the rest of this part of Africa, where we also have an increased showing of groups or networks which refer to them as Islamists, I leave it to others maybe to address this. Let me come to my answer to what should be the solution. I think what Wolfgang just told us at the beginning about this appeal by this German foundation that one should have dialogue even with people who are Islamic terrorists or claim to be. This, by the way, is nothing new. I mean, I have been saying that for years. The only question concerning the so-called Islamic State back in 2014, 15, 16 was whether the IS would have any interest whatsoever to sit down and negotiate. This was the only question, which was never certainly found out, because nobody actually ever tried to talk to them. And then what would have been the subject on the table at the time? What could one have offered, etc. But that it would have been necessary, and that one should never exclude to talk to anybody, is clear to me. But I think this is by far not the sufficient answer to the problem. Because that would also only be maybe a possible response in a situation where you already have an existing Islamist terrorist group or network, and which might have already committed acts of violence or whatever. I'm much more interested in the question: what are the root causes? What are the root causes for this phenomena of Islamistic justified terrorism, as I prefer to call it, which we have now since 2001, obvious for everybody, but I would go further back, 1993, which was the year of the very first attack against the World Trade Tower in New York. And if we go further back, we would have to go back to the times after the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan in December 79, when the US started to arm Islamic groups in Afghanistan. Actually, as we do know today, they not only did it in response to the Soviet occupation after December 79, no, the US government of the time, Mr. Jimmy Carter and Brzezinski as his national security advisor, they started arming Islamic groups in Afghanistan by at least June 79, so half a year before the Soviet invasion. One of the persons that was militarily trained and supported financially at the time was Mr. Osama bin Laden. But if you really look for the root causes, then I think we have to take a closer look to this region, which I show you in the map here, between Morocco on the northwestern tip of Africa, all the way through the so-called Maghreb states in the North African area, then what we call in Europe the Middle East, the Saudi Peninsula, and all the way to Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Because I think what we have to deal with is the historically very different development in this part of the world compared to the development in Europe and North America. What do I mean by that? The people in Europe and North America, which was mainly populated by European colonialists since the 18th century, have reached, if I may call it this way, three things. Number one, finally agreed on somewhat national identities, which is not so long ago. In Germany, the German nation is not existing since more than 1,000 years, as some right-wing radicals claim. The German nation is only existing since about 170 years, since Mr. Bismarck, the Chancellor of 1861. Before that, we had tribes in Germany. The tribe where I'm coming from in the Rhineland, Cologne city, and tribes from Berlin, where I live right now, they were killing each other by the thousands, the Bavarians and the Saxonians also. So it's not so long ago, historically, but at some point, the nation state and nation identity were reached in Europe and North America. Secondly, what we reached is finally agreement upon the borders between our countries, which again is not so long ago. Germany and its neighbor France fought 3 bloody battles since 1871, again in the First World War and the Second World War, in certain areas which are now French, used to be German, and vice versa. And again, we are now in a historical period where some of the borders in Germany are being put into question, whether it be by the Hungarians who want to go back to their Greater Hungary, whether by certain separatist groups in Spain, or whatever the arguments and the reasons are. So it's not secured forever. And the third, probably most important achievement is that all the nation states in Europe and North America finally developed a national economy which at least fulfilled the basic needs of the population. By basic needs, I mean food, drinking water, everybody has a roof over his or her head, medical treatment, health systems, education, etc. This might all sound very banal, but I think it's very important to understand that on the basis of this, what I would call somewhat socio-economic security, which is still not perfect in our countries, and for many, many and more people are falling through the security network, also in Germany. But compared to many other parts of the world, I think it's a very much higher security system economically and socially. Only on the basis of this socio-economic security, we then in Europe and North America have developed the political systems we have today, which we call democracy, as different as the democratic systems between the US and Germany and Switzerland and Great Britain might be. But it's democracy where the governments are being elected by the people, we have developed the division of powers between executive, the government, and the legal system, and the parliament. And it's, at least till now, understood and consensus that the power lies with the government, and that the government, if need be, is allowed to use police or other means to enforce certain rules, which has been currently put into question if you look at the arguments about the corona topic in Germany. But these three achievements that have been reached in Europe and North America and Australia, etc., most of the countries in this region on the map have not reached or have not been able to reach, or only to a very insufficient degree. And why is that? Not because they're whatever, less clever or stupid or whatever. No, it has to do with the colonial history. That those countries in the last 400 years did not have the possibility to free and independent development like we had in Europe, because with one exception, the exception of Iran, all of these countries between Morocco and Afghanistan have been colonies. Most of them till 1945, some of them even longer. If you look at Algeria, which only got free after a bloody liberation struggle in '62. And even since they are formally independent nation states with a name, with borders, with an ambassador at the UN in New York and Geneva, they are still not really independent, because the former colonial powers, mostly now member countries of the European Union, still exert a lot of negative influences over these countries. With the French, it's most obvious, and their former colonies, but also the other ones, the Germans, the Italians, the Belgians, the British, whatever, through the, for instance, the trade agreements or treaties between the EU and many of the North and Northwestern African countries, those agreements which are being called European Partnership Agreements, but have not much to do with partnership, because they are very much to the advantage of big companies in the European countries, and very much to the disadvantage of the more weaker economies of those African countries. If you take the issue of arms exports of European countries into this region, the robbery of the fish grounds of the northwest coast of Africa by high-tech trawlers from the EU, but also from Japan. So there are many, many, many negative influences still exerted. Secondly, the people in these countries experience that their governments, which mostly are not democratically elected governments yet, but rather authoritarians or even dictators who are very corrupt, who exploit the people. But the people experience that these regimes are being supported by the West throughout the last 70 years, always with the Western argument that only those autocratic or dictatorial regimes, like, for instance, Mr. Mubarak in Egypt for 40 years, would guarantee stability. And in this situation, where you have a government that is suppressing you, exploiting you, is being corrupt, you have no chance for independent development, especially for young people. You don't have a chance to feed a family, to raise a family, to feed it, etc., etc. And you experience the Western democracy being behind these regimes. And this is new for the last 15 years, now many people in these parts of the world also have internet connection, have their smartphones, and therefore they are very well informed about how well off we are in Europe or the US or Australia. I can understand that maybe religion is about the last stronghold. And since 95% of people in this part of the world, if they are religious, are Muslims, it's clear that the religion you might turn to is Islam. And if you are living in such a desperate situation, it is well possible that you go back to parts of the Quran which are certainly outdated because they stem from the time of Muhammad of the 7th century, where Islam was in a very different situation, in a minority situation against Christianity. And then certain phrases that have been said by Muhammad are being transferred into today and are being used as justification for intolerance against Christians or against non-believers. So what I'm trying to describe here, this is the breeding ground for possible then the justification for violence and terrorism. And we will only overcome this phenomena of Islamic terrorism, which by the way, 95% of the victims are not in Europe or North America or Australia. 95% of the Islamistic justified terrorism are Muslims in this part of the world. The only way to overcome it is if we find ways to help these countries and these people to make the same positive developments we in the North, in Europe and North America have been able to make in the last 200 years. Which means, number one, to end all the negative influences we still have vis-à-vis these countries, and I have mentioned a few of them, certainly stop the war against terrorism, and the one battle I didn't mention because it's still going on is the war with drones, the illegal campaign of killing executed by the US government. This is all counterproductive and creates more and more despair and hate and possibly then willingness to use violence. So ending all the negative policies and influences, and secondly, systematically support the economies of these countries, mainly by providing good education for jobs. That's what these countries need, well-skilled people, not necessarily university students or professors. This is not what you need to build up a functioning economy. That's also the experience of Germany after the Second World War. Those who built up Germany after the time with a lot of help from the US were not the professors or the people studying at the universities, but all kinds of crafts, engineers, etc. you need. And for example, to launch a campaign to say within the next 5 years, we want to help train 100,000 young men and young women from Morocco to Iraq in those crafts and those jobs that are desperately needed in these countries. That would be a very constructive engagement. And the second one, to make sure that if companies from the rich Europe invest in these parts of Africa and the Middle East, that this is an investment not to take out as much profit as fast as possible, but a sustainable investment that provides jobs and opportunities for the people in these countries. So these are just two examples for constructive and positive policies we should use to try to overcome the breeding ground for potential terrorism. And hopefully in 25 years from now, if we conduct such a politic, this phenomenon might not exist anymore. Thank you. Hallo? Ich höre nichts. Hallo? Hallo? Ich höre nichts. Hallo? Hallo, hallo.
Du musst dein Mikrofon aufschalten.
Entschuldige, Andreas.
Ja,
sorry.
Jetzt höre ich dich.
Also, it was a super presentation, fantastic, I must tell you. Yeah, also all the points which you mentioned. And I think the Algerians one is Fadel is there, but stop now the presentation, whoa, that we can see us.
Yeah, I see you. I see you all. Yeah. I see you all.
Yeah. Sharing. Warte mal. So. Now, yeah, warte mal. We have to stop the presentation. I don't know how. Who knows how we do it?
Warte mal.
Hier, Freigabe beenden. Jetzt müsst gehen.
Yeah, Freigabe beenden. Yeah.
Good.
I see you all. Yeah.
So then we get comments now. Guy, what do you say to the presentation?
Well, I'm very thankful to Andreas for this extensive presentation. Thank you so much for enlightening us about the history of terrorism and how the Western countries have been facing this terrorism, and which I very much like the end of the presentation, like showing how it is still difficult in the South countries to counteract terrorism because some basic needs are not guaranteed and people are still trying to survive. And when trying to survive, you can't afford to counteract terrorism, which are huge machineries, which are supported by some powerful countries. And I always also like some of the way out of how we can go ahead this, because talking about, for instance, of the Western companies and the lack of jobs, it happened that in the northern part of Cameroon with the terrorist group Boko Haram, they have recruited many young people among the poor people in the community, and those who almost had nothing to take care of themselves, young people from 14 years to 25 years. Most of these youth have been recruited by the terrorist group, who pay them lots of money, and most of them, they generally take this money, they give to their family before they leave to join the armed group, because they say the government have not provided any means for them to survive. Yep. And they have an opportunity to have resources, and they are sure they can go and die in the warfare. They take the money, they give to their families, and they leave to the bush. And sometimes the family encourage this because they have no other ways. They are using their younger people to make money to survive, and this about life. There is an organization in Cameroon who conducted a study about this recruitment of young people by Boko Haram, and one of the strongest recommendations was that the government should be responsible of its youth, because the authorities have abandoned everything, and it is up to everyone to find means to survive. And the terrorist group, they are there with lots of money, and they recruit a lot of people. And this is also happening in the war in the southern Cameroon, in the English speaking country, where the secessionists, they have lots of money. They have been kidnapping people and taking a ransom, and from there they have lots of money, and the government loses control here because they cannot employ the youth, and in the other side the youth have where they can have money, and this makes the battle very difficult. So if you can do something for the younger people to be on the better side, this is one of the powerful way to counteract terrorism. So I liked very much this presentation, and it applies very much in our context, as some of these measures can be.
Thank you, Guy. Let me ask you one question, if I may. Do you have any indications that those terrorist groups in your country, besides the money they get out of kidnapping or whatever, do they get any financial support from whatever outside actor, other government, other country, like we have in the Middle East with the Saudis financing those groups? Any indication for that in Cameroon?
We don't have indication for a particular country, but from individual, yes, because we have Cameroonian living abroad. They live in Western countries, and there they make lots of money, and they support the terrorist group back in the country.
Ah, yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, you know, one French-speaking Cameroonian, she told me that she even thinks that behind this secession movements could be powers from US or Canada who like to destroy the nation in Cameroon. What do you have anything heard like this, or it was just a French from the French lady? Guy.
I don't have evidence. I don't have evidence to say the same. Well, in like 4 years back, some arms were taken from terrorist group in the far north in Cameroon, and the press, the media said these arms were coming from France, and there was not. France did not deny the fact that the arms were coming from them, and from there we could assume that France was supporting somehow this group by providing the weapons, and the support I think we can see from the US, for example, is that they support the army, they support the national army, and not the terrorist group. That's the fact. But what they claim here is that they support the army who fights against who violate human rights, a lot of human rights, including civilians' rights in the fight. And the public opinion in Cameroon sometimes accuse the US that they support the war in the country at large because they provide financial support to the government, the financial military equipment, military aid trainings, and all that. And it is the same support that's been helping the government to fight the population and the secessionist group in the war. So it's like a mix of understandings about that, but in concrete facts. But I'm not sure I can actually say that they have support. The terrorists are supported by those countries.
Okay.
Fadel, what is your opinion? Maybe you should introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, my name is Fadel Sadan. I live in Norway. I am a pro-peace, pro-democratic activist in an Algerian movement called Hirak. It's a pro-democratic movement. And the situation in Algeria is slightly different than the other countries because in the 90s, it was internal violence because of this Islamist movement. And Algeria paid a very high price it was like 250 killed and 20,000 people disappearing. So that what made the mentality of today, where movements are in general peaceful because no one want to go violent, no one want to go back to the 90s. So actually in Algeria, and it's very funny, it's the state which is the terrorist. It's the state which is doing act of terrorism to try to trigger violence right now. It did put all the activists in prison, and it's basically starving the population right now to only trigger a violent movement, which basically in majority is that no one wants in the population, because everyone understand that it's only with peace that we can build a country, not with war. But on the other side, this war against terrorism, in my way of seeing it, had two different aspects of it. The first one, it shows that actually the West can attack any countries and can use any reason to take your resources. Because for me, it's all about resources and only about resources. So there is a position now, like I take as an example, the Algerian military dictatorship, where to stay in power, if they don't want, since their wealth, all their wealth, all of it is in European and American banks. All their families lives in Europe or in America. All the real estate, their houses, their big, their firms that are in Europe, their wealth is already abroad, not in the Algerian banks. So they are these people, these wealthy people, actually, they received the message with this war against terrorism that if you don't do what we want you to do, we're gonna create problem for you internally. So this is what I understood in general of this. It's a new way of bullying, and before it was like, yeah, colonialism. Now it's a type of neo-colonialism we install violence in your own country if you don't do what we want you to do. And you can call it...
No, just one question. What's your answer to the question? What Western governments, European ones or US, actually do want from the regime in Algeria to do? So what is it? Why they pressure them or blackmail them or whatever? What is it they want them to do?
To continue to not give up for democracy, to continue oppressing the people. You can't leave the command and leave a democracy in your country. You have to stay in charge and oppress and kill and put in prison, because as long as you are there, we are guaranteed that your resources are gonna come to us.
But then let me rephrase the question. How you analyze, what is the concern or the fear in Western capitals, in Washington or Berlin or Paris, that if your country would become a democracy, what's the concern? Why would Western governments be against that?
It's because the condition of taking the resources will not be the same.
Okay.
Instead of treating one a person who doesn't like his country, where it's only to bribe him, to give him money directly, and you take whatever you want in any quantity you want.
Okay.
So this is my way of thinking.
No, I got you. I understand.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm finished.
Yeah, I want some teases which I got to understand the whole thing. One is after the attack in New York on the Twin Towers, Gallup, the Institute of US, made a poll and interviewed 30,000 Muslims in the whole Muslim world. And the result was the following. The majority of them likes Western values, but they said, we know that you don't want Western values in our countries because you can't control us anymore. So this is very interesting. Even they said the whole Western world, we can do it, but you don't want it in our countries. With our dictators, you can get the resources much easier than if we control them. They understand our system much better because they feel it, they see it. Yeah. They know that they are cooperating with the dictators and that the other thing is not true. Second, the French philosopher Alain Badiou, he says the Western countries can't really colonize anymore, but they can destroy states. What after the independence was achieved in nation building and in escalating the conflicts, they can work with militias, give them weapons and get the resources. So, and he said, is a hell. He calls this region Sunage. If you live in these areas, your life is a hell. So this is a kind of recolonization. And the third is Mr. Harvey is from US, a Marxist scientist. He says the US used the attacks on the Twin Towers to justify again war, because the Americans after Vietnam War were tired to go to war. And the war in Afghanistan was just an entry. I read on Democracy Now! From a lady from America. She worked in Afghanistan when they started the war. And they said after a few weeks, the embassy people of America were already in Iraq. It was an entry. The aim of this war was to get the petrol station of the world. That means to control, besides Saudi Arabia, now Iraq. And they just use, but they could not bring Iraq anyhow together with the attacks on the Twin Towers. So they used Afghanistan, and when the people have swallowed it, they went immediately to Iraq. And Harvey said, why? Because if they control the petrol station of the world, no other force who want to come up, like China, like Japan, like Europe, they are all depending on the Americans, because they all need this petrol. And in controlling this station, he thinks was the main reason that for a lasting domination of the US in the world, that they fought this war.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I have to leave. I thank you, and I hope you have a good ongoing discussion. See you again.
Can we rely on you again? Because it was really fantastic, and we want to make a network really to stop this war.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Okay,
we can
bye.
count on you.
Yeah, I do my best. Bye.
Thank you very much. So, Zala, why did you come so late?
I just missed, I thought it's at 7.
But it was always published 666. No?
Yeah. I never relied to this thing, because for my mind last time was 7.